everybody, and welcome to our session today on Multilateral Development Bank MDB reform. My name is Karen Morris, and I'm from South North, working on the Voices for Just Climate Action program, VCA program, as the Knowledge Management and Communications Manager from South North. So what we're going to do today, we're going to run through a bit of housekeeping and welcoming, and then we'll hand over to Josh Ogada, who is our facilitator for today, to do the introductions of the speakers. So thank you everybody for joining us today. It's really great to have you here, and thank you for making the time to join us. So for a bit of housekeeping, if you've used another link to join, if somebody shared a link, please can you adjust your name tag so that you can include your name and your organization. That way we know who is exactly in the room. Also, while the speakers are presenting, please ensure that you are mute so that the speakers aren't disrupted while others are speaking. Then we have some engagement. So how to engage for the session. If you have a question, we do have a Q&A box that is in the bottom of your menu bar, or wherever you see it on your screen. You'll see it has two little chat boxes. Please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box in your language. We will try to get to as many questions as we can. Also, if you'd like to make a comment, please do so in the chat box. And if you'd like to perhaps make a voice comment, please raise your digital hand and we'll promote you as a panelist if you'd like to do so. Otherwise, you can put your question in the Q&A box. So for today's session, we do have interpretation in English, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Indonesia Bahasa. Please feel free if you do voice a question, feel free to speak in any of your languages. Also, just to join the channel for each of the interpretations so that you can hear the session in your own language. For English speakers, please join the English channel so that you can follow the session. And of course, if you're speaking in your own language, please feel free to do so, and the interpreters will assist. If you do have any technical questions, please send an email to info.vca@southnorth.org. So here we have the agenda for today, which outlines who our speakers are. And from this point, I will now hand over to Josh Ogada, who will introduce the session and give an overview. And yes, welcome, Josh. Thank you so much. And over to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this session on Multilateral Development Bank reform. We have an exciting afternoon, quite a long afternoon, quite packed with content, and really looking forward to it. My role is just to guide the discussion. I will be facilitating, but most of the speaking will be done by our speakers. Just before we begin, just to kind of lay out what the day looks like, we will open with a scene-setting presentation from Yared Segai from South North, and then we'll go straight into the discussions. We are very excited to have with us Bianca Getzel from ODI, and also Carola Mejia from Fundación Avina, who will be presenting to us. In between those discussions, we will have sessions for Q&A, but as Karen already mentioned, please feel free to use the Q&A box, and I will also ask the speakers to keep an eye on that. If there are any questions that could be answered live while the presentation is going on, that's fine. Otherwise, we will deal with them in the Q&A session. And looking forward to quite lively discussion, looking forward to engagement from our attendees. Very happy to have you all as participants. We will have a short coffee break just because it's a long session before we go into discussion on specifically focused on the Voices for Just Climate Action's engagement in the MDB reform process. And then we will close off with a quick overview and reflection session to end the session. So very much looking forward to it. Yes, it has been mentioned that we have interpretation. So my plea to the presenters and to everybody, whether you're asking a question or not, to obviously pace yourself so that your thoughts and ideas can be effectively communicated by interpreters and everybody can participate in the discussion on an equal footing. So at that point, without any further ado, I'll welcome Yared to kick us off with the scene setting. So over to you, Yared.
Okay, thank you, Josh. This session is being hosted by the Global Program and the SSN team doing Global Program, and generally the Global Program, the key objective or strategic objective of the Global Program, one of the work streams is to create supportive conditions and regulations of international funds for local climate action. And there are multiple priority action areas for the Global Program work stream 3. The first priority action area is engagement at the UNFCCC processes. Under those, we had the loss and damage finance conversation, I think 2 or 3 weeks back, and the ongoing work the Global Program is undertaking under the new collective and quantified goal on climate finance. There has been an opportunity for the VCA team to prepare and submit 3 submissions on the collective goal. And the second element of these priority action areas is to engage in influence international financial institutions, to promote finance for local climate solutions. There are 2 work areas under that. One is strengthening civil society engagement with Green Climate Fund, Adaptation Fund, and other similar funds, and then to engage as well on the MDB reform agenda. And the last element, which we started last year, is to promote and mobilize finance for local climate solutions. There are multiple activities which has been undertaken. One is developing a portfolio of locally led solutions to identify alternative finance delivery mechanism. I think last year there has been some work undertaken on that. And then the VCA program has the next level grant facility. And one of the work that the Global Program is undertaking is to track the next level grant facility. In terms of the MDB reform, we probably most of you are aware that MDB is a key player on climate finance. If you sort of look at the finance, the 100 billion, the so-called 100 billion commitment, some of the resources, 30-40% of those resources are being sort of channeled through multilateral development banks. So they are sort of an important player of climate finance. And the outcome on the COP27, it gave like a clear sort of direction for MDBs to play significant to increase their climate finance, both in adaptation and mitigation. And I think last year and this year, the Indian presidency of G20 had set up an expert group on strengthening multilateral development banks. In the last, I think 2 months back, the report was sort of released, and last month as well, the finance minister of G20 had a meeting and session around the same issue, around the reform agenda of MDBs. And for some of you who are following up on the work of World Bank as well released the evolution roadmap in 2023, and there's an ongoing conversation on this sort of evolution roadmap. So we speaking about World Bank, but various other multilateral development banks, there are various efforts towards the reform. So there are sort of various efforts around the reform agenda. The optimism differs. There are some of us are optimists, some other people may not be very optimistic about this reform, because it's not a new sort of conversation to have. I think probably we had this conversation for the last 20 years of some form of reform, and sometimes people are satisfied with this type of reform, sometimes people are not satisfied. So, but we approach it with a certain level of optimism. And I think there are various perspectives in terms of the depth of this reform, what the approach should take, and the processes of the reform agenda. So there is multiple viewpoints, and obviously as civil society, we do have a right to have a certain viewpoint. But for us, more importantly, is to ensure that the voice and perspective of multiple stakeholders, but especially the climate affected communities to be taken into consideration when you have such conversations. So the sort of for the VCA, the type of work we are trying to do around here is to connect with like-minded movements on MDB reform. I think multiple movements have come up with their own positions, and we are trying to connect with those positions, and probably as well to see what are the risks and what are the opportunities in those various perspectives which are emerging in this reform agenda, and to engage effectively in the process. So there will be multiple activities which follow this specific session. This session is basically designed to help us to articulate and understand what are the opportunities and what are the risks which comes with this reform, and to engage globally, but as well as at a country level, what is the civil society take on this? So over to you, Josh. Hopefully this is going to be very helpful session. Thank you. Josh, over to you.
Thank you very much, Yared. Yes, so at this point, I'm very glad and happy to welcome Ms. Bianca Getzel of ODI. She works as a researcher, and her work and research and advisory work focuses on MDBs and the development finance institutions, and specifically how reforms in the international finance architecture can unlock resources to address today's global challenges. And I think looking at the reform process and the timelines within the MDBs is very pertinent to this discussion. So Bianca will be talking a little bit about the climate smart reform within the MDB infrastructure. So welcome, and over to you, Bianca.
Hi, Josh. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. So as Josh laid out, I'll be talking today about climate smart MDB reform and what that means for civil society as well. Just a brief note on the agenda. I will be going into a bit of detail, so please do put questions in the chat and ask me any clarifying questions on that as we go along or at the end. I will summarize the current reforms on the table. Josh and Jared kindly asked me to do that, which I'm pleased to do. As I go along, I'll be talking about the priorities for civil society and notes along those lines, but don't necessarily worry too much of remembering those, because I'll summarize them at the end in a bit of a more structured way. So before we get into things, how do MDBs work? And I just want to set the scene here because it's actually quite important to understand what each initial stands for. So when we say they are multilateral, we mean that they are owned by countries that thus become their shareholders or owners. You can think of it like a big co-op, effectively. Some of these are clients or borrowers. I'll be referring them today as client countries. Some are donors. So the United States doesn't take money from the World Bank. It just puts money in, for example. And some are both, like South Africa. So there's a range of these shareholders. For the World Bank, there's 129 member countries. And then the D, they focus on development. That means they provide low-cost finance for investments in future prosperity, economic development. And historically, this has been aimed at poverty reduction. And this focus is very important. The context of the MDBs and how their agendas have been reset at the beginning of the 2000s followed discussions on the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, which brought a focus on poverty reduction, not climate, which is why we're here today. And lastly, this is a point a lot of people love to forget. They are banks. So they lend money. Shareholders provide capital, making MDBs really, really secure investments. They provide that capital in form of cash that MDBs can then give out to other countries, and in forms of guarantees that will step in if things go poorly. So because of these factors, MDBs can issue bonds on international capital markets and have really, really good rates because they are so secure. And so countries that are clients of the MDBs can access funds at a way lower cost than they would do otherwise if they simply went to the bond market. And then, of course, there's a range of client countries, some of which want to take out loans and have the capacity to repay interest, and others who don't and are just taking on grants from MDBs. This difference between client countries that take on loans, so middle income, upper middle income, are called non-concessional, and those who instead just focus on grant funding are referred to as concessional. So with that in mind, why are we talking about MDBs? In my view, the focus now placed on them speaks to the fact that not only, as Jared said in his initial remarks, that they are important, they are essential to climate action in low and middle income countries. This is because of the fact that they have a global and regional reach that extends to both the public and the private sector. They have really deep experience implementing large climate relevant projects in low middle income countries, and they provide great value for money to mobilize financing at scale. So let's just talk about a couple key figures to give you a sense of perspective. The biggest MDBs, which usually refer to around 7 of them, hold 1.8 trillion in development assets. They are actually the largest contributor of the climate finance target, the 100 billion to date. And this is a point that I'd really like to stress. At a time of inflation and limited fiscal space, and shareholders having very shrinking national budgets, the MDBs provide great value for money. And by that, I mean when you invest $1 into an MDB, over time, you will get $40 out in how much it can invest into low and middle income countries for climate action. If you instead put that $1 into a vertical climate fund, so the Green Climate Fund, for example, Jeff, you get $1, 1 for 1 versus 1 for 40. So that's why we really care about these banks and we want them to do better, because they are ideally placed to address the challenge. However, they themselves are facing several challenges. And I'm going to put these in 3s and also into 3 S's. So they need to be smart, they need to have scale, and they need to be simple. So when we're talking about them being smart, we're talking about narratives on climate and development. So as I referenced before with the point on poverty reduction and that focus, except for a few MDBs, global public goods, including climate change, do not feature in their mandates. So that means in the mission statements of the World Bank, nothing referring to climate or sustainability is mentioned. In the Evolution Roadmap, which has been kind of the working paper, the white paper covering what the World Bank thinks it can begin to reform to, they do propose a change in the writing of that mission statement, but that still has to be agreed. And the other big 7 also don't mention climate. So this leads to then, when MDBs are operating, a view that climate and development objectives are mutually exclusive. To do one, you have to get trade-offs in the other. And that's not really true. It leads to a very short-termist view. You know, there's nuances to that argument, and we'll get into those as we go along. But that leads to MDBs not seeing a lot of the co-benefits that can happen when you do an investment in public health. You can have a co-benefit for climate and vice versa. So they end up really kind of narrowing their view and eyesight in what is the realm of the possible. And more so, this kind of narrow view also leads them to not using their funds as efficiently as possible. So they are not always Paris-aligned. The MDBs continue to have fossil fuel investments, for example. They've all retired from coal, but they are still holding investments in big airports, highways, and these are diversely contentious. So that's the smart element. The scale element, which is, in my opinion, what kind of kickstarted these reforms, and we'll get into that, has meant that MDBs are risk averse, and because of that, they are not stretching the amount of money that they have enough. Even though I just said that 1-to-40 ratio, great value for money, they can do even more. And this conversation is what has been referred to in technical jargon as the capital adequacy frameworks, or the CAF. And just to give you a viewpoint here, these are MDB commitments to climate finance collectively 2013 to 2021, I believe. Yep. And this is what it would need to look like in 20, who knows what, hopefully 30, in order for them to address the financing gap related to net zero achievements amongst low and middle income countries. So even if they stretch their balance sheets, even if they mobilize private finance really well, so get other investors to join along with them, the problem is that they'll still need more money. And the best way to assure that we don't face the risks and trade-offs between climate and development is to have more capital into these banks. So the shareholders, US, France, Italy, UK, need to commit to want to put more money into these banks. So the first piece of homework is the banks have to work to use their money as best as possible and stretch it as best as possible. And second, the shareholders, in order to fill the finance gap, also need to commit more money into them. And then the last point is regarding the simplicity and suitability of these operating models and lending operations of the MDBs. ODI colleagues here ran a survey of client countries, of government officials in line ministries across 70 plus countries, 500 plus officials. And that survey revealed that climate finance isn't high on the priority list of a lot of client countries. Where it appears within the top 3 instead of MDB management, when you ask client countries, they tend to focus on agriculture, health, things that are more relevant to their own development agenda. So there's a mismatch there. So when we talk about reforming MDBs, we can't just talk about supply. We have to also make sure that we're simultaneously incentivizing demand. Let's say the MDBs scale up the finance, begin to lend $1 trillion more. If client countries don't want to take on those loans, it becomes a fruitless exercise. And something that further disincentivizes client countries demanding MDB loans is really high hassle factors or indirect costs tied to taking an MDB loan. The bureaucratic load of an MDB loan is unlike any other. There's really long timelines, environmental safeguards, environmental ones, which we should care about, actually end up extending timelines by over half a year. So there's something about the MDB operating model that isn't quick and efficient enough for client countries to want to borrow. So with these challenges in mind, and Jared kind of gave a brief overview of the timeline of these reforms and where we are, but I do quickly want to touch on why we're here and why I think personally that this moment is different than others. And that doesn't mean that I'm optimistic about this moment. It just means that compared to conversations we've had over the last 20 years, the scale of attention put to these institutions has been unlike what we've seen since they were first set up in Bretton Woods. And in addition, it's a slightly different conversation. And that story starts with COVID, and just bear with me here. During COVID-19, a lot of national budgets began shrinking, public spending was severely cut, things became very difficult across the shareholder base. So the US, UK, they were struggling as well. And at that time of crisis, the World Bank knocked on their door and said, in order to make sure that low and middle income countries are able to survive this crisis, we're going to need you to advance us money and give more money to us. And maybe correctly so, the shareholders were left a bit frustrated and confused. We're at a time of crisis, we're dealing with our national problems, and you're coming to us asking for even more money. And so out of this frustration, the G20 under the Italian presidency commissioned an independent expert group to look at how they can sweat their balance sheets, get more juice out of the lemon, if you will. And that's, again, the Capital Adequacy Framework review. And so Italy and then, the G20 that was taken over by Indonesia do this CAF report. It gets a lot of attention. And as this is happening, we're also seeing client countries be in a moment of extreme polycrisis, whereby the speed and scale of the climate catastrophes that they are facing was ever rising. Debt levels, because of COVID, largely became unsustainable. And slowly, private investors started fleeing low and middle income countries due to higher interest rates in developed markets. So this momentum then led Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, to gain a lot of momentum, speak at the UN in the General Assembly, and then announce what has now been coined as the Bridgetown Agenda. The Bridgetown Agenda covers a lot of points about international finance. One of these is MDBs. And because of those cries and the attention that both shareholders and client countries were beginning to put on this agenda, MDBs appeared in the final decision paper of Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27. And why does this matter? Because MDBs have never been mentioned in a COP before. They were absolutely are outside of the UNFCCC mandate, but they became so important that they got mentioned there. And then this all culminates into the G20 now under the presidency of India. So the agenda gets now owned by the Global South. So where were we? So yes, the G20 in India takes the presidency, and the agenda is reframed in a place where not necessarily, I would say, client countries' concerns were being heard, but at least they were given a platform. And this climaxed even more so in Paris at the Summit for the New Financial Pact that was hosted by Macron and co-hosted by Mia Mottley. And this was outside the normal policy cycle. And that was really important because Macron, maybe to his, now he probably regrets it, gave the mic to leaders across client countries and told them, complain about MDBs. And that's exactly what we did, what we saw. We saw the Kenyan Prime Minister and President really complaining about what was happening with MDBs. And the anger and frustration really became stark. And that's where we are now. We are at a point when shareholders, the biggest ones, the US, France, they really care because they have shrinking national budgets, because they want to get value for money. And client countries are facing a poly crisis and are beginning to get a platform and have formal and informal fora being handed over to them. So with that in mind, I'll go back to the kind of 3 S's I referred to before and at least try to go in a relatively speedy manner through the reforms on the table. The first one is on updating MDB mission statements. I referred to this before. I'll touch a bit on the risks. There are some controversial views among client countries, especially on what should be considered a global public good. So, we know climate is one, is health one, is debt one, is biodiversity one. So what ends up being defined and mentioned within that mission will really matter. And different client countries obviously have different priorities on this. And then in addition, the operating model of MDBs, even though they have a regional and global reach, is based on a country-based model. And that means that projects are run by country officers in each place, which doesn't make them perfectly well-suited to address problems that are transboundary. Poverty in Nigeria matters for Nigerians, doesn't really matter to Italians, but rising emissions in Switzerland matter for South Africa. So the operating model needs to begin to shift. And if we don't see that addressed, that's the only real risk we see. And in the notes for civil society, why I say consider the updates to the governance model is because the minute we expand the mission to say, we're going to include something that is transboundary, who is going to represent that at the board level? When the board needs to decide, do we invest in a climate project or do we invest in this economic development project, who is going to play climate's voice and run that argument? Right now, there's nobody there to do that. There's some discussions that civil society should own a place within the board of MDBs, for example, to advocate for the climate itself. Then the second point is improving support for climate smart development. And here it's, as I mentioned, not every country's national strategy focuses on climate. And the problem there, and I think what civil society can really influence, is something that almost lies outside the MDBs themselves. And this is, to me, one of the most powerful things civil society can change and influence, which is keeping governments accountable for climate smart policies. A great example, I'm sitting in London in the UK. We've recently seen our government really retract on climate commitments, and civil society is correctly very angry. And insofar as client countries and who represents them, so the government officials at the MDB level, are also interested in climate and have a reason to care about it because their domestic constituencies are forcing them to, then the MDBs, by consequence, will be forced to deliver on that agenda. Lastly is Paris-aligned MDB portfolios. And again, I think there's limited risks here. We don't really need fossil fuels investments. We're not really risking a lot. The biggest thing we can do to avert any risks there is make sure that MDBs are also considering transition finance. So helping, for example, a lot of countries in the Asia Pacific who have a lot of divestment to do as they go through that journey. But generally speaking, again, civil society has a huge place here, advocating for Paris alignment and agendas that kind of reflect the UN process that civil society has been able to influence very effectively to date. Then we go into the scale of MDBs. I've added a column here because not all of these are very instinctive, but I'll just touch on a couple of points. The capital adequacy framework recommendation and mobilizing private finance both are about reframing the risk appetite of the multilateral development banks. Because they want to make sure they can offer low-cost finance, they really prioritize being a secure investment in the eyes of the financial capital markets. And that at times can be counterproductive because it doesn't allow them to leverage at scale, to really take into account the list you see in this first box to the left, right here under explainer. That is a list of things that the MDBs have that make them really safe investments that right now they're pretending as if they didn't exist. So if they accounted for those better, we could get farther. But for civil society, something to really consider is that both the capital adequacy framework recommendations and private finance at scale are two aspects that target non-concessional borrowers. So going back to what I said at the beginning, it's mostly about middle income and upper middle income countries that don't need grant finance, that are not amongst the poorest. So when you are talking about assuring really high impact investments, the CAF recommendations and private finance mobilization have a bit of impact in that because the bigger the balance sheet of the MDBs get, the more money they have in total. That's great. They can also finance the poorest. But generally speaking, they are targeted to those upper middle income countries. So as we advocate for those things, we need to make sure we are simultaneously advocating for concessional finance. And these two things I've just mentioned, the first two rows, are something that civil society can definitely influence. However, a lot of these processes have begun and they are quite technical. So it's up to you in a way whether you believe this is a priority for your agenda and it's worth getting through the barrier of understanding all those financial complexities. And there's civil societies across the global north and global south who have decided to venture on that journey very successfully, which we've advised as well. So then the point on concessional finance. So the whole concessional window that attacks poverty action, that really looks at anything to do with loss and damage, adaptation financing. This is what civil society has generally really advocated for very successfully. Replenishments of the concessional windows of these banks in the World Bank, that's called IDA. And there's the only thing to consider here is that you already have high influence as civil society. There's many advocates in this space, but it is also simultaneously one of the best ones to reassure that we are limiting any risks and trade-off between climate and development. And the final thing, and this is something that Jared alluded to in his introduction, came out of the independent review report that ODI actually contributed to as well. And talks about a new fund, so part of the MDBs, but a new mechanism additive to them that only focuses on global public goods like climate. And in a way, this helps us shift the narrative because we're saying we don't need to simultaneously deliver on development and climate. We add more money, add another window, and do both. So theoretically, it has great potential. The one risk is that it's up to donors, so usually the biggest ones, US, et cetera, to decide where that marginal dollar goes. In their budget, are they going to put more money in the MDB that is also targeting poverty and is also targeting adaptation? Or are they going to put it in the new fund that is going to only target mitigation finance and other global public goods? And then we get back to the governance model question, right? If we have a new fund, to me, if I were civil society, and even not a civil society, but just someone that advocates for MDB reform, it is instinctive that someone needs to represent climate in this fund. So finally, the reforms on simple and suitable MDBs. So the first one is about safeguards. And again, civil society, especially civil society in the global north, has really influenced this agenda to the point that they have done so successfully that there is a tension between the really long timelines of MDBs that need to be shortened and the safeguards that are protecting indigenous communities and maintaining ESG standards. All I want to say is that African countries had the opportunity to borrow from the MDBs at less than 1% interest rate. And instead of going to the MDBs, they decided to take money from the Eurobond markets, which has part of why we're in this debt crisis. And they were totally, in many ways, logical and correct in doing that. Why? Because the timeline of an electoral cycle of any country, no matter where it is, can't wait around for MDBs to approve their safeguards. And so they had to act on their feet. And this is a failing by the MDBs that they could not adapt their model to make sure that their client countries were incentivized to borrow from them. But there's, again, a balancing of opposition. When we at ODI speak to civil society here in London and across Europe, they recoil at us saying that safeguards need to be loosened. So this is kind of a big tension that, in my opinion, unfortunately, has been influenced almost to our demise at this point. And now we have to figure out what to do about it. And then it's strengthening the technical offer. And this is, it's quite minimal as a point in the reform, but can be very important because it's about MDBs effectively saying, we are going to give you technical advice by handing you a 200-page report and plopping it on your desk. And then it's up to you to figure out what you do with that report. And I'd argue that's not a really great way to influence climate smart policy in any country. So we need to change how MDBs are providing that advice. And then there's a point on the quality of sustainable finance. So there's products that MDBs currently have. For example, debt that is issued in US dollars that is really problematic to the debt position of low and middle income countries. And there's a lot of ideas of how to get better at that. The problem is that the way to hedge those risks is really expensive. And so MDBs are not incentivized to take those costs on right now. That said, in my opinion, I'm happy to get into this in the questions, really high influence potential for civil society, advocating for the type of finance that MDBs provide to be something that makes sense within the national budgets and the debt position of their client countries is essential. So with those in mind, before you get lost in this matrix, I want to give a very quick disclaimer that by no means am I prescribing any of the priorities that I think civil society should take. I thought it would be quite helpful to put these on these axes, and to be quite honest, what's on the horizontal axis and where I place that is completely arbitrary. I'd be really, really happy if you guys wanted to continue that conversation, and where you'd want to put the different points on this matrix would be very interesting for me to learn about. But effectively speaking, as civil society considers what to do, the three first points of action are understanding the reform options on the table. Here we are. Unfortunately, that for MDBs has a lot of transaction costs. It requires money and time to understand all of these reforms and understand them well and all the politics behind them. But it is, in my opinion, a really worthwhile effort given the importance of these institutions. Second is engage with relevant stakeholders and keep friends accountable. That includes myself. I work in a think tank in London. I try to do my best to advocate for MDB reform in a way that makes sense for climate smart development. But at the same time, I am often held to the standards of academic publishers as opposed to the standards of policymakers in the countries that matter. And I should be held to account for that. And third is establishing priorities by thinking about influence and relevance. So now we're seeing this matrix on the right. And as I referenced, something that, in my opinion, scores really highly on the top right quadrant is things like advocating for governments to be held accountable for climate smart policies to make sure that we have the demand from client countries. Civil society has been historically great at doing that advocacy. safeguards. I've gone through the civil society process here. Really high potential influence, and reaching the right balance, I think, will be really important to the agenda. Concessional finance. So making sure that there's enough money on the table and enough money to treat the poorest on the table and those that need most impact addressed. Civil society, again, has historically been extremely successful at doing. Then there's other things like, as I said, the capital adequacy framework recommendations. We've gone pretty far in those. We don't really need to focus on them. They're quite technical unless you really are interested in them. I then propose you look at the One Campaign's work on this. It's been really, really great. If you look up One Campaign CAF, you will find a review of the advocacy around this issue, as well as our work, obviously. And just on a final note, I'll share these slides. I'm not going to go through this. What's in italics is what you can expect to come out of all these moments in the policy cycle. But this is a future-looking timeline. And what I just want to highlight as a final comment is, I know that today I'm lucky enough to be hosted by everyone. I think most of you are based in South Africa. And the reason I mention this is because the fact that the G20 with an Indian presidency has taken the pen of the reform agenda has meant so much in its direction. And we at ODI are trying to do our best to make sure G20 Brazil also really cares about this. And I know it's early, but the following presidency in 2025 is a South African presidency. So if we could see an alliance of Brazil, South Africa, India, alongside all the other client countries, effectively being able to lead on the reform agenda of these pivotal institutions, that is extremely powerful. And if more so we can focus on how they can become smarter, more scalable, and more suitable to the countries for which they are meant to serve, I think we'll get a lot further than we are today. But thank you very much. That's all I have. I'm sure I went over time, so apologies. I thought I'd be faster, but don't know if we want to take questions now or go over to Carola.
Thank you so much, Bianca. Quite a lot of information, but very well done in getting through it. And I think there's a lot to learn and a lot to talk about there. At this point, I'm going to open it up to questions, and I will keep an eye out for any hands popping up. I do not see anything in the Q&A. The one thing that has come out in the Q&A is people asking if general questions around the presentations being shared. The answer is definitely these presentations shall be shared, obviously with the prior permission of the presenters. So you will have access to this information, and it'll be shared to all the participants. So you can rest assured about that. Just to get the discussion going, and I suppose slip in while I have the mic, Bianca, a couple of questions from my side on things that stood out for me. You did mention the value for money question between the MDBs on the one hand and the vertical funds such as the GCF. Now, in our work, I'm just thinking about it. If there is such a big disparity in value for money in favor of the multilateral development banks, how does that mitigate against the work, A, and B, the commitments that countries who also happen to be the key shareholders in the MDBs, they've made certain commitments to the GCF and other vertical funds, especially the climate funds in this context. So if there's such a great disparity in value for money on the MDB side and against the GCFs, do you feel, or are you finding in your research that it has kind of dampened their commitments to their GCF because the multilateral banks are there? I mean, we know we're talking about reform, but we understand the issues that are there. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
No, that's a great question. And just quickly on the slides before I address it, if Josh and Jared agree, I'd also be happy to share some links that summarize our work, but also other really important work on this issue for everyone to access. But on the vertical climate funds, I think we've seen shareholders begin to retrieve on their commitments to them. They've kind of begun to stagnate, especially what it was 5 years ago. We saw shareholders investing into a lot of the different funds, and now they're only really concentrating that money in the Green Climate Fund, which takes up, I think, around 70% of Vertical Climate Funds' money. But the really other important thing to note here, Josh, is that when we put money, shareholders put money into a Vertical Climate Fund, 90% of that money goes to the multilateral system, ironically enough. So 70% of that is MDB specifically. So the climate funds ends up being a middleman for shareholders to put money into the MDBs. And when you speak to MDB management, they get really, really unnerved about the idea that their shareholders are putting money into these funds. That said, in my opinion, they started with a really important mission, which was to include national actors and really get to the local level in the ways that MDBs can't. That was their promise. We're going to act on climate, and we're going to act really targetedly, involving the players that can assess risk the best, that know their location the best, that have contacts to the right investors. And that's a really good claim. Unfortunately, they haven't been able to deliver on that agenda. But if we retreat on the vertical climate funds, in my view, someone should own that responsibility. And there's a lot of conversation on how national development banks can be better leveraged. You have an amazing one in South Africa, for example. So right now, we're trying to have that conversation also happen as part of the MDB process. But I really hope that that focus of the vertical climate funds doesn't get lost, because even though in many ways they haven't delivered super successfully on it, there was a lot of potential there. And we've written a paper on national development banks for a net zero world that touches on the failure of green climate funds as well. So, Jared, I see you have your hand up. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, I think probably I read it somewhere that there is slight worry in terms of MDB's reform to sort of focus on middle-income countries vis-a-vis its initial focus on low-income countries. I think it was in some publications. Do you share that concern?
I mean, what we've seen is that luckily, a lot of the low-income countries have graduated out of that category. And so the MDBs have correctly adapted to address the issues of lower middle income and upper middle income countries, simply because their client base has progressed. In an ideal world, these institutions at some point will stop existing, right? But that doesn't take away the fact that, as you correctly point out, before they could address the issues of a client base whose development status was more homogenous. Right now, the development trajectory of the client base has gotten a lot more different. And that means that MDBs have to respond to both upper middle income and really low income countries. And this is what I was getting at. And there are risks to this. When we talk about climate, there are big risks to this, because really, right, addressing climate mitigation means that you're going to channel funds more to middle income countries, less to low income countries. So if you want to address that risk, the best way, in my opinion, to advocate for it being addressed is making sure that those concessional windows are getting all the finance they need, first off, that MDBs are getting a general capital increase. So shareholders are just putting money into the MDBs, investing more money in. That way they have a bigger capital base. And third, that when we talk about the issue of CAF recommendations, capital adequacy, and private sector mobilization, we advocate to make sure that that non-concessional quote-unquote profit gets maximized to then fund the concessional windows and fund low-income countries. So there's a way to create those reforms that are more about capital adequacy and private mobilization to make sure that they really end up also cycling into the concessional windows and acting on poverty and acting on, let's call them traditional development mandates, if you will.
Okay, thank you so much. Josh, over to you.
Yeah, no, thanks so much. I'm keeping an eye out for hands. I don't see any. And just before we go on to the next one, Bianca, just something else that you talked about that I think is very apropos in this discussion. The issue of civil society. Deborah, I see your hand. I'll come to you just now. It's the issue of civil society's influence and the role of civil society in keeping governments accountable. Now, maybe we can touch a little bit more about that, because I think there's a bit of a nuance when there's a difference when one talks about civil society. I mean, you did mention, for example, the role that civil society is playing in the UK, for example. Now, civil society in the northern countries who are shareholders, a lot of whom are shareholders, is different, and I think in a lot of ways stronger in this regard, because being able to influence governments who are shareholders in the reform process, I think, goes a little further than in the southern client countries, where civil society, often there are social political issues that limit the voice of civil society, which is one of the things that we are working on. So I think there are different roles there, and maybe it's something just to touch on a little bit. I know there's a role that southern civil society can play, but I think there is a bit of a difference in terms of how far that goes, whether it's civil society in a shareholder country versus civil society in a client country.
No, that's great. And I tried to touch on this a bit in my remarks. And I think, as you said, there is a really, really stark difference. And it also ends up having important ramifications, as I brought up in the point about safeguards, for example, because the priorities of the global north are not those of the global south. One big thing, one is in my slides, I also, in the timeline, if we look back at them, I showed when the World Bank had its external evaluation process open. So it had process open for comments to the World Bank evolution process, and that was open to everyone. Luckily, a lot of actors in the Global South took part in that process. And that's one way that they tried to do better. What I will say, it's by far not enough. And one thing that really struck me is that the new independent panel review, which I think is really great, has a lot of great reforms on the table. If you look at the bottom annex, you'll see the civil society organizations that they reached out to for consultation. There's around 40 of them, not one is from the Global South. That is a huge problem. And when we talk about how we are including varied voices, and I hope, and this is why I talked about the importance of the process being owned by the likes of India, Brazil, South Africa, client countries, is because they will, by consequence, involve their own civil society and bring them to the foreground. But there are aspects that I think relate to progressing the civil society agenda, not in the global north, that can happen through collaborative partnerships. And a lot of foundations that care about MDB reform, philanthropic foundations, I mean, have begun to engage with civil society and partnering them with the likes of myself at ODI and think tanks and, more research-led institutions, and effectively have pushed us to work together to figure out what we're going to say when we advocate to the MDBs. And also because that way we have to worry about all the technical jargon, not civil society, who should be worrying about values and priorities. Another thing that I think really could go farther is if we begin to have better discussions about the governance model, because we can reform the MDBs, but this problem about the voices that should be heard not being heard is partly because there's no one in the board of these MDBs saying and advocating for them to be heard. So when we talk about reform, we should also look at governance. So that's another thing. And then lastly, there's a point about data. We have very little data on what client countries and civil society and advocates and communities within them care about, and what their priorities are and what they want MDBs to do. I mentioned the survey that we did that we had to rely on, but that was with government officials, and I have no real sense as to whether they are correctly representing the communities that they are meant to. So there's also that problem around, if we were to get better data, that we can use in a punchier way to advocate for the values that matter, we'd get farther. But again, it's putting the burden on people that shouldn't have that burden to begin with. We should already have that platform and those engagement be part of the process. And the best way to do that is to hit it at its core within the governance model of these banks.
Great. Thank you very much. Deborah, your hand is up. Please go ahead. You can unmute yourself.
Yes, I just did. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Great. Without question, the best event that I have participated in months, and I participate in a lot of events. Thank you. So I have two quick questions. One is, we organize youth, which, you know, UN definition, it's like 18, it's up through 34 years of age all over the world. And so we have that voice to bring to this and these efforts. We also organize with mayors and subnational governments all over the world, including a lot in the global south. If we want to engage more with more sophistication as civil society in this, what would you recommend be the next best steps? Who do we connect with who can help us be more effective in these efforts? And then secondly, we work with publishers every single week. We're meeting with the main academic publishers, and they have new commitments to close the gap between practitioners and researchers and to convene them so that practitioners can inform the research agenda and so that we can get out more co-created research, but all research to practitioners, to policymakers. And so when you said you had pressures because of academic publishing, I actually think we could help with that when we have, you know, the Wileys and the Taylor and Francis and Springer Nature, et cetera, Elsevier at our table. So I'll put in my email into the chat and we can follow up on that. But I wondered if you could speak to how do we more effectively participate in this to get better outcomes from a subnational government and a youth voice perspective.
So that's a great question, and I'm really glad you found this useful. So thank you. What I would say on the subnational point, really, really interesting to know that you're working on that, and please do follow up on email, because here at ODI, we actually have a mayor's agenda that we're kind of leading with several different cities across both the global north and global south and trying to get those subnational voices in. And one thing that ends up being really kind of pivotal to having that conversation is exactly that, having mayors from different places agree on a priority list when it comes to an agenda that is multilateral goes a lot farther, and this applies at the national level as well. The other thing I would say relates to how subnational leaders impact their national, their kind of federal voices and bigger representatives. They have a much closer touch to what their communities need and care about. And as civil society, not only should you, if you want to influence the multilateral process, one of the faster ways to do that, if you have influence already with your subnational players, advocate for them to influence their national players on stuff you care about. And I'm sure part of your work already covers that. And on the youth, unfortunately, I have to say the UN is a lot better at youth engagement than the MDBs are. And this is also something that has begun to prop up in the evolution roadmap. And I don't really, have to say, have an extremely eloquent and articulated answer to this, not one that is thought out, at least. But at a kind of instinct level, what I would say is similarly co-work with different organizations across the platform. Also, ideally, if you can collect data and succinct information, case studies, any of that sort of stuff, which you're likely probably already doing, and get a place to present those platforms, that ends up again resonating a lot further. I did mention this point about philanthropies now trying to include local leaders and local advocates better. I really would if you're not looking into this, leverage this, especially philanthropic foundations that have the most money, like those here in London, because they are now reframing also not just wanting to put more money in, but they are deciding how do we approach these partnerships in a way that is equitable and makes sense and is right, yada, yada, yada. And right now they're deciding on that without really advocates from the places that matter. So they're not really going to get probably very far once they begin implementing this new finance at scale for local advocacy, if they don't already have advocates in the conversation now while they're framing their approaches. So I'm happy to follow up in a conversation and discuss who those actors are and how to best collaborate with them. And I think absolutely on the academic side, we need all the help we can get. So it's great to know that you think or you can be a bit more optimistic with collaborated support.
Thank you very much. And Deborah, I'm pretty sure you've forgotten to put your hand down because you also forgot to tell us which organization you're with after asking such a great question. So please, if that's okay, could you tell us what organization you're with?
Hi, I'm with so I'm president of the U.S. Partnership for Education for Sustainable Development. That's a nonprofit that's based in the U.S., but we run Youth for Climate Education, which is international. We work with HESI, which is the Higher Ed Sustainability Initiative. That's 10 UN agencies and higher ed networks for sustainability around the world. And then we also work with groups like ICLEI, which is the subnational governments. There are others, but those are some, and the Clean Energy Ministerial. So we're working with over 100 countries in a workforce development piece there. But if workforce development for clean energy and just clean energy transitions isn't aligned also with the funding for the communities, then this whole thing's not going to work. So I think that answers your question, and I'm putting in something to the
what I would say,
panels.
Deborah, just a last note is if you haven't seen the Country Climate and Development Reports, CCDR is the abbreviation, from the World Bank, this would be a great place for co-benefits tied to youth, employment of youth, to get a spotlight. And right now that's not something that is really covered, but would almost be a low-hanging fruit to advocate for. And the reason those reports really matter is because those reports are what the World Bank takes home and then ends up acting on. So whatever is said there kind of sets the agenda for each country. And a lot of them are being released month by month, really. So I would urge you to take a look there. I can send the link as well.
Thank you.
Great. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Bianca. And thank you for the additional information and answering those questions. It's time for us to move to our next presentation. We will be hearing from Carola Mejia, who's a Bolivian economist specialized in sustainable development with over 15 years experience as an advisor in public, private, and international cooperation organizations, as well as coordinating regional networks. Carola's main experience in the last 8 years is related to climate finance and climate justice, and she's currently part of Fundación Avina, which is one of the alliance partners in the Voices for Just Climate Action. And within Avina, she's working in the Climate Transition and Resilience Program. And she also works as a climate finance analyst for Latindad. So welcome, Carola, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Josh. I'm very happy to be here with all of you. As you mentioned, today I will be representing two institutions where I'm working and where I'm currently working. And I will try to bring the Global South and developing countries perspective to this discussion about the MDB reform. So first, as Bianca and you were also mentioning, MDBs play a very important role in mobilizing finance for development. And lately, this role has been questioned, especially in recent years, because the multiple crises have deepened, the challenges are getting worse, especially for Global South countries. And to give some historical information, I will also like to highlight that the Bretton Woods institutions, like the World Bank Group and the IMF, have been established in 1944 with the aim of placing the international economy on a sound footing after the World War II. Yes, I was saying that the Bretton Woods institutions, like World Bank Group and the IMF, have been established in 1944 to improve the international economy after the World War II, and also help countries rebuild their economies. So the situation there was very different. Now we're facing a multiple crisis with different challenges, and yeah, most global North countries have recovered quickly after the war, and they enjoy strong and wealthy economies, which is not the case of our countries. I'm from Bolivia in Latin America. 79 years have passed and challenges have changed a lot, but not these institutions. So there is an urgent need for them to reform. In this very difficult context of multiple crises, we have been facing the impacts of the pandemic. It has, of course, repercuted in a negative way in the economic system, international economic system. We're suffering from a political crisis. There is a war in Europe that is affecting all the world. We're suffering for a food crisis, and also environmental crises that are getting worse as time passes. For example, the biodiversity loss crisis and the climate crisis, which is the one that I'm going to be focusing more. Of course, this situation of multiple crises has increased vulnerability, especially in the global south. The pandemic and the uneven recovery between countries and within countries have also increased inequality. And as Bianca was mentioning as well, it has also led to an increase in debt in regions such like mine, like Latin America. To give some considerations about climate finance, because maybe many of you don't know much in detail about this technical topic, climate finance is aimed to fund mitigation and adaptation projects and measures worldwide to tackle the climate crisis. Climate finance needs for developing countries have been estimated to be between $5.8 to $5.9 trillion until 2030. So it's a huge amount of money that we need to tackle this crisis from the global south perspective, and until 2030, in order to be able to fulfill the Paris Agreement goals. There is an international climate finance pledge done by global North countries in 2009 in Copenhagen to mobilize $100 billion per year from 2020. But this goal has been unfulfilled. And as we can see, compared to the other amount that I was mentioning, it is highly insufficient to tackle this problem. Within this 100 billion pledge, or the climate finance that is being mobilized internationally, only 24% is being focused in adaptation. Most of it is going to mitigation, which is very something that we have to highlight and worry, because adaptation should be a priority in the global south. It is a priority in the global south, considering that we are already being affected by the impacts of climate change. Other problem with climate finance is the mechanisms to access this money are usually complex, and the application process for some international funds and donors can take years, and they are very different from each other. So they are very bureaucratic and difficult processes. For the Green Climate Fund, sometimes it takes up to 5 years to have a project approved. So we cannot wait. The climate emergency is here. The challenges are here right now, and we need this climate finance to be to get to the people quickly. There are a few direct access windows for non-governmental stakeholders, which is something that we are also worried, because most of this climate finance is going directly through governments. And another problem is that 72% of international public climate finance is channeled through loans. 81% in Latin America, 88% in Asia, for example. That is increasing debt levels, which are already high in our regions. And another problem is that there is no single methodology nor definition that serves to provide transparency. There are different methodologies, definitions that are being used. So there is a need to use one only definition and methodology to make this more transparent. And as it was previously mentioned, in COP27, there was a call for MDBs to reform and respond better to the climate crisis. So I will bring now some institutional positions on this and the MDB reform. I will start with Fundación Avina. Fundación Avina is a Latin American foundation that is working very closely to donors, MDBs, but also with civil society, the private sector. And for Avina, as part of its new climate finance strategy being developed right now, MDB reform is very important, and it should help address the following issues. Improve climate finance access for developing countries, that is very important. Strengthen capacities of developing countries to access climate finance and prepare good projects to be able to get this money from the international climate finance. And also to establish and promote simplified and direct access windows, especially for vulnerable groups. We have noticed that this is a big issue, and vulnerable groups are not receiving this support and this money, and the processes should be simplified. Right now, we have a project called VCA, which is trying to do this. It's like a pilot project trying to simplify processes, make it easier for some groups to access to climate finance. And we are hoping MDBs can also do that in the future. The other problem that we also want MDBs to address is that they are prioritizing mitigation projects. And node adaptation, which I mentioned, is very important for developing countries in the global south. This is something that also needs to be addressed under this MDB reform. So now I will try to bring a different perspective. It's more critical, and it's from Latinidad and the economic justice movement. I will develop more on this part because Latinidad and the economic justice movement have been working on these issues for many years, very closely following the evolution of MDBs, the international financial system. They have been calling for a new financial architecture for many years now. So they have a lot of analysis and a lot of points that I would like to share with you all, to also consider some critics from the civil society perspective, because Latinidad is a Latin American network made of civil society organizations. And the economic justice movement as well at the global level, it's made of many different CSO organizations. The first critic I want to highlight is related to the relation and the interlink between debt and climate, which is something that Latinidad has been working on the past 2 years and a half. There is a very strong interlink between these problems. And we strongly believe that climate finance should not be increasing debt levels in developing countries, especially considering the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. In this small map that I put here, we can clearly see this was an image taken by NASA, which shows us how global north countries are the ones polluting the world. Really, they are, and they hold this historical responsibility on the climate crisis. They have been creating this climate crisis, and now they need to respond with different efforts. But climate finance is supposed to help countries in the south, low and middle income countries, with resources from rich countries. But unfortunately, as I mentioned before, 72% of this international climate finance is being delivered through loans. In the case of MDBs, the last OECD report shows us that this is even worse, considering that 91% are loans. And very different to what Bianca was mentioning, 75% of these are non-concessional loans, which are high-cost loans with high interest rates, expensive and with conditionalities. And we can see this in the graphs in the bottom, the percentage of loans and the percentage of non-concessional finance that is reaching our countries to help us tackle the climate emergency. So this is not working, and it's not going to work. And right now, under this MDB reform narrative, international community is requesting to expand the role of MDBs and to expand their operations. And as Bianca was mentioning, these are mainly banks which offer loans, especially. And if these loans use the same conditions as right now, they are going to make the debt situation even worse. And right now we are in a very critical situation regarding debt. 54 countries worldwide are struggling with debt problems, very close to debt distress. In Latin America, we had a debt crisis in the 80s, and it was very tough because countries couldn't repay their debts, and they had to do a lot of things at the national level, and that has a lot of implications for the most vulnerable groups. And I will try to explain this in the next slide. A greater debt service, or to have to pay more debt, implies less public money to invest in climate mitigation and adaptation, less resources available to recover after catastrophes that are being more frequent as time passes, and we can see that every day in the news. Less money to invest in other sectors aligned with the 2030 agenda, being historically discriminated and marginalized groups who suffer the most: women, indigenous communities, poor families, rural farmers, children, the youth, the elderly, among others. And also it implies fiscal adjustments and conditionalities where the first thing to be cut is public spending on environmental and social issues. This is also called as austerity, and I'm sure maybe you have heard about this in our countries. And also another impact of debt, of having these big debts in our countries, is that it pressures more global south countries to overexploit natural resources, because we have extractivist systems. We rely on the export of raw materials. For example, in the case of my country, we export gas, and that's very important for our national income. So to repay these debts, we are getting deeper and deeper into extractivism in these high polluting sectors, mining, hydrocarbons. And that is not letting us leave this cycle and this very dangerous path of development, which has not solved all these structural problems we are facing today. And of course, that also delays our accomplishment of our own national determined contributions. And right now, many Latin American countries are spending more on debt service than on public health, education, social security, and climate action. And there's a lot of data on that. The second point I want to make is that when we talk about this MDB reform, we heard a lot of how important it is to leverage private investments. And Latinidad and the economic justice movement thinks that this will not solve the climate crisis in the global south, especially. MDBs are using public resources to de-risk and attract private investors for climate projects, using guarantees, blended finance, public-private partnerships, under this narrative that there is a big financial gap that we need to fill. And under this MDB reform, they are planning to focus mostly on this strategy. It has called the cascade approach, which has also been implemented for the development agenda and didn't really lead to good results. Why? Because it reduces important amount of money that could go directly to finance high quality public service and adaptation measures. I'm talking about public money that could go directly to these sectors. It is very important to acknowledge that private capitals are moved by profit and the desire of wealth generation at any cost. And so there is lack of interest of most of these private investors to fund climate resilience, adaptation measures, and loss and damage, which is not going to give them profit, which are a priority in vulnerable countries like mine. And also another thing that we have been highlighting is that bringing more contributors to the climate finance table, MDBs, private sector, philanthropy, has also the risk of neglecting the full responsibility that global north countries have regarding their historical, ecological, and climate debt, and the lack of fulfillment of their climate finance international commitments, which should come mainly from public resources. And here I want to say that the G7, G20 are calling for an MDB reform to respond to the climate crisis. But these countries are part of the boards of these MDBs, and they are the ones that have not been fulfilling their commitments. And I want to show that this narrative that there is not enough public money is false, because we know the public money is there, but going to the different sectors that are harming the people and the planet. For example, this is a chart that we prepared in Latinidad for a report that I will try to share with you later. We can see climate finance in 2020. It didn't reach the 100 billion, 83.3. And we can see how it's going to fossil fuel subsidies that in 2022 reach $1 trillion at the global level. How it's going to military expenditures, $2 trillion in 2021, before the the war between Russia and Ukraine started. So you can imagine now how this number has increased a lot. So the priorities of the political people are not good, are not well. They are really prioritizing short-term wealth through investments in sectors that are harming, that are really taking us to this point of no return. And it's very, very frustrating for climate justice movements and people working on this every day. The third point I want to make is that MDBs are still funding fossil fuels, and Bianca, I think, mentioned it as well. MDBs have committed in 2017 to align their investments to the Paris Agreement, but they are years behind this schedule. For example, the World Bank will align 100% of its new operations from July 1st this year, but the private sector arm, which is the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, and the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency will do it in 2025. So it is not going to be achieved soon. MDBs are still funding fossil fuel projects. The World Bank has financed over $16 billion for fossil fuels since the Paris Agreement. The World Bank Group says it's not funding fossil fuels, but they still have projects related to gas. For example, the World Bank provided 12% of all G20 and Multilateral Development Bank related public finance for gas projects in developing countries between 2017 and 2019. So we can see that, yeah, they are still funding these kind of projects. And also, as Bianca was also mentioning, there are some projects in infrastructure that are also harming people and that are having some impacts for communities that are being displaced, for big projects, for example, hydroelectrics, infrastructure projects, and they are really not receiving a fair compensation, or they are not receiving respect to their human rights. And that's a problem that many civil society organizations are also working on. They have been developing these observatories to monitor the operations of some MDBs, for example, in Latin America, the IDB, which is the most important development bank. And yeah, they have found many things that are very worrisome. Even though these banks have these safeguards, sometimes they are not being fulfilled or respected. The other thing is that MDBs, the MDB reform should lead to a more democratic and fair economic governance. And I completely agree with what Bianca was also mentioning. Within the board of directors of international, for example, the World Bank and regional MDBs, for example, the Inter-American Development Bank, donor countries, mostly governor countries, are responsible who are responsible for the historical climate and ecological debt, hold most of the shares. So therefore, they have more voting power in decision making. And I'm going to give you some data that I've been gathering regarding this. For example, in the World Bank, USA has 16% of the shares, and Bolivia only 0.06%, and South Africa 0.7%. In the IDB, which is supposed to be a Latin American Development Bank, USA holds 30% of the shares, while Bolivia holds only 0.9, less than 1% of the shares. So our countries that are most being affected by this multiple crisis, by this climate crisis that they have not really created of cost, they are now facing all these problems. They don't have really power to impact these decisions over these reforms, over these processes, over how things should be made within the international financial system. And right now, loans and debt are really a neo-colonial instrument for controlling some countries. And that's something that is really choking on our economies, our governments. They really don't know what to do. So countries that have more needs have practically no voice power to change these things, and this should be addressed as part of a governance reform as well within these institutions and within the international economic system as well, because right now the G20, the G7, the World Bank, the IMF are the ones taking the big decisions in the world, while the United Nations is a more democratic space where our countries have at least similar voting power. but the decisions are being taken in these other places and these other spaces. And this needs to be also addressed. And also another point, very complicated point, is that many MDBs are promoting market-based fall solutions. Many MDBs, especially the World Bank, has been promoting carbon markets to tackle the climate emergency. For many climate and economic justice movements, and Latinidad is part of that, these are fall solutions to effectively reduce CO2 emissions worldwide. Personally, I agree with that approach. I don't think carbon markets are going to solve the problem. The capitalist system fueled by consumerism and extractivism has caused most of this environmental crisis that we're facing today. So markets will never solve this problem if they have caused them. It will be like using gasoline to extinguish a fire. So we have to be very aware of that. I respect very different positions, but I want to raise this from the climate justice and economic justice perspective. And finally, another point that I want to make is that there is a need for an indicator that goes beyond the net national income to categorize the low, middle, and high income countries. Right now, this categorization is based on a World Bank indicator that uses this indicator, the net national income, very linked to the GDP of a country, the gross domestic product. 107 countries are categorized as middle-income countries, and this category limits their opportunities to access concessional finance, which is cheap finance, cheap loans with good conditions, long-term periods, low interest rates, and also debt relief initiatives, and does not reflect all the multiple vulnerabilities and challenges that these countries suffer. So I would like to address this because it's very important how countries are being categorized and how this is limiting our ability to access this kind of finance. For example, most Latin American countries are considered middle or high income countries. Even Haiti is a low middle income country. And Haiti, we know, has been a poor country for many years, facing different challenges. And yeah, this is not helping us. We need an indicator that really reflects all these multiple vulnerabilities and challenges that our countries are facing. Most of the world's extreme poor live in middle-income countries, to give you a data of how this is wrong, as a wrong perspective. So what do we expect of all this MDB reform? What can we demand as civil society? We can demand more concessional and long-term climate finance from MDBs with faster and direct window access for non-governmental stakeholders, especially vulnerable groups who are in the front line of this climate emergency. We should ask and demand for climate finance not to increase debt levels in the Global South, which is a problem that we are currently facing. And if it's not tackled in a timely manner, with also considering this climate crisis, it's going to, it's like a vicious circle that is going to get worse and worse and worse every time. MDBs should provide more public grants and technical assistance for adaptation in the Global South. That is really a priority for us, instead of focusing mostly on mitigation. And they should give more importance to life sustainability than to debt sustainability. Right now, the banks are have more interest in guaranteeing that a country can repay its debt, but they are not really understanding the repercussion of these debts in the life and well-being of the people of these countries. So this is a very important approach as well. We need a new indicator that goes beyond the net national income, based in real needs and multidimensional vulnerability assessment of the countries. We need a reform that could lead to a more democratic and fair financial system, this reform of the governance that Bianca and I was mentioning, more transparency, and we need MDB projects not to harm people and the planet. We really need to address this. They are supposed to respond to development, so development should not be harming anybody, nor the nature, nor nature or the planet. We don't want more fossil fuel funding from MDBs, and that should be very clear. And we need to monitor how this alignment is going, and it needs to be fast. And we need a new development paradigm that puts people and communities in the driving seat of their own development pathways and priorities, and is centered on states' obligation to citizens, economic, social, and human rights with a gender perspective. I will share with you some documents, there's, for example, a statement signed by 74 CSOs of the economic justice movement, where Latindad has participated, that gives more detail on what I briefly mentioned here. And yeah, I will invite you to read that, to have a more critical perspective of groups that have been working on these topics for many years. And yeah, I will also try to share another report on climate finance from Latindad that has this climate justice and debt relationship approach. And maybe it could be useful to expand a little bit more on the information. So thank you very much. I'll be looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Carola, for the great presentation. I'm sure there'll be opportunity, and I'll definitely be looking to you, Bianca, to, I suppose, maybe respond to some of those things. Just looking at the Q&A box, as there's a question for you, Carola, which maybe you can start off with, from Jeff Sinclair, asking, what are your views on the difference between sovereign debt and private sector debt, and between loans for general sovereign spending versus loans for projects that have a payoff? And should they be considered differently in the context of climate finance, or are they all the same?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. Sovereign debts are, of course, the debt acquired by the governments, and this could go to different sectors and priorities. As Bianca was explaining, the governments are clients of these multilateral development banks and have their own priorities. The banks and the countries develop a strategy, a national strategy, and that leads to the projects that are going to be funded. While, private sector can also have their own debts, but also it's important to acknowledge that the governments right now have been, the sovereign debt is also with private creditors, and private creditors have been gaining a lot of importance within global South countries' debts, and that's very difficult to tackle because there is no international sovereign debt resolution mechanism, and right now it is only solved within, for example, the Paris Club, where these big creditors are the countries that are creating the climate crisis, which are the same countries from the global north. So it's very difficult to solve these problems. And I don't remember the second question. Could you repeat it, please, Josh?
Yeah, the second bit was around the difference between loans for general sovereign spending versus loans for projects that have a payoff, and whether these should be considered differently in the context of climate finance, or whether they're all the same.
Yes, loans for sovereign spending could go to political issues, or to public policy, or to fund projects within the country. And they are very similar if you consider the conditions that are being given to these kind of projects. And projects that pay off, for example, mitigation projects could have a profit from the results of a project. So that's easier to pay off, to pay for these loans. But for example, social, for example, public services, health, education, adaptation, art sectors that they are not going to be profitable. These are sectors that need to be invested in, social investment, and these need to be public investment. That is why we were trying to make this critique with involvement of private investors, because right now MDBs are trying to leverage this private capital to the table to respond to close this financial gap, while at the end these private investors have more appetite for the projects that pay themselves, for example, mitigation projects or other infrastructure projects, but not for these other projects that have this climate resilience, adaptation. I'm sure there are some private investors that could have some interest, but most of them won't.
Thank you very much. Bianca, I'll come to you, and then after that, I'll go back to a couple of other questions from Maria Jose and from Rowan. But please go ahead, Bianca.
Are you sure? Do you want to take those questions?
Yeah, well, we can take them. I mean, there was the one from Maria Jose who's asking, who's talking about the influence of civil society on governments in many countries, which is the reality in the global south. That is very limited. I think this is something that we've touched on, and in some cases, it's already it's on the decrease. And what could be alternative mechanisms to influence in this context? And I was looking at this question and just reflecting on your comment, Bianca, about the need for data, and then Carola, your presentation that was quite data driven, and how the importance of having sufficient data, accurate data, and getting that data into the right hands is a very powerful tool. I mean, it's also a space where northern and southern civil society can partner up. When there is data, then it's easier to make a point and use that as an influencing tool. So I suppose the question is around alternative mechanisms for influence in the space where we've got limited civic space in the global south and non-responsive governments.
Yes, I've been working lately with a lot of different regional networks of civil society regarding the climate agenda. And I can see how civil society is very well organized in our countries, and especially climate justice movements. There are a lot of movements well organized within the national boundaries. And I think there's a need for them to be more involved and create synergies with this other movement, the economic justice movement, or the groups that are working more on this financial architecture reform, which are topics that are not really easy to understand. And that's something that, for example, Latinidad, this economic justice movement, is trying to do now. We're trying to work more with climate justice movements, youth movements related to the climate agenda, that are now more interested in this new financial architecture reform. And it is very important to understand how this is a systematic problem. And within our countries, I think we need to work more in developing more information and data, which sometimes is very problematic in our countries, we know. But we need to approach also our politicians, for example, organize events, dialogues with congressmen, with ministers, and in that way, or also not only develop demands and critics, but also proposals, and to approach these proposals to these decision-making political decisors. Sorry for the bad English. So I think it's very important to make these advocacy efforts and to identify within the year which are the important milestones and events that could be important to reflect this kind of proposals and this kind of information, and also to work very closely with the population, with education, sensibilization of the population about these topics and the importance of tackling them very fast, because time is running out, and we really need to address these problems.
Thank you very much. Bianca, please go ahead, and then I'll come to you, Yared.
Great, thank you. Just while we're on that data point, I want to say we've presented the survey that ODI ran on government officials to many groups of civil society across both the global north and global south, and by both we correctly got a lot of slack saying, why did you interview government officials? And unfortunately, that was just something in regards to limits of access and what our funders wanted. But I think due to the fact that also funding appetite is shifting, and it is an absolute misfortune that that's what we have to worry about in having these discussions, but due to the fact that it's changing, I think it would be great if a think tank based in a place like London, like ODI, alongside a civil society network in the global south, pitches to a foundation, a research project saying, we want to collect data on community involvement and thoughts and values on international finance. I think probably we're in a place where there's appetite for that to get approved, for example. So just on now a reaction to Carola, a lot of what you said, thank you so much. I found it personally really valuable to my work to hear both the perspectives of the different foundations that you work for and represent. I did want to address some of the points mostly around private finance mobilization. And I'm here acting as devil's advocate. I'll put my personal beliefs aside. But to note that these MDBs, as we've addressed, they are banks. And even though they have absolutely catastrophically failed in what has been called the billions to trillions agenda, so mobilizing those private capital actors, we were hoping to get what we call leverage ratios of 1 to 50, 1 to a trillion. That didn't happen because of exactly what you said, Carola. They focus on profit. They don't really want to fund a lot of the projects MDBs worry about. With that in mind, I absolutely believe that private mobilization has a role in MDB financing. And the reason for that isn't solely to get investors to be part of the conversation and get more access to climate finance. It is also because having private mobilization be something that MDBs engage in is what builds local capital markets. And civil society have often had a kind of black and white view on this, of saying concessional money is what matters. It's what's going to get us to hit poverty and impact. And that's absolutely true. But in a world where a lot of the countries are moving on in their development trajectories and are at different stages, I think there is a role to say MDBs have a responsibility to build local capital markets. Why? That means if I am able to get an investor from the US, for example, to want to invest in climate finance somewhere in Africa, what will that do? It will begin to price a project. It will quantify risk. It will pool other domestic actors into the game. And these things can be really important to building local capital markets. Whether we want to do that or not, obviously, that's capitalist rhetoric, is up to us. But there is a nuance of what private mobilization can do. And Carola, I agree with you. I think this is what you were nuancing. We shouldn't have leverage for leverage's sake. Something that MDBs are beginning to think about is having these really big numbers of we've mobilized this much. Why? What was the point of you mobilize? Who did you do that for? What did you address in doing that? If they can't answer those questions with a profile of answer that is based on impact, the number is completely irrelevant. You're just telling me you allocated public money to, as you said, de-risk private investment. That in and of itself isn't something that should be in the mandate of MDBs. But if they are mobilizing to create a market, I think there's an argument for that. On your point now on non-concessional loans, again, I think it's really important for civil society to advocate for more concessional money on the table. And that is absolutely the priority. How you get there, what conclusions you believe in order to prioritize concessional money is irrelevant, because it is so useful to limit risks and trade-offs between development and climate. And things like loss and damage, for example, I completely agree with you there, Carol. They're never going to be profitable. You cannot insure loss and damage. You cannot guarantee loss and damage, right? So that goes without saying. We need to advocate for concessional money, no matter our perspectives on MDBs. With that in mind, if MDBs are going to focus more on climate finance, and part of that is to be mitigation, we should not want MDBs to have a huge portfolio of grant money that they are targeting to countries that don't need grants, that have domestic investors already there, that, for instance, solar in most of a lot of the middle income countries in Africa, for example, is profitable and commercial. We shouldn't even see MDBs there, let alone grant money or concessional money be targeted at that. So there's a range of projects of how MDBs can finance climate action. And what we really need to work on is making sure that we continue to have enough concessional finance, which is exactly what you were saying, Carola. And second, that really important point that I didn't really touch on, but I'm really glad you did, on allocation mechanisms. Because if we don't change how we view where we believe public investment should go, for example, to things like adaptation and loss and damage, we will be working against formulas that are fighting against us, because that's how boards make decisions right now. And I completely agree on the point of concessional allocation. So those were just my couple reactions, and I'd be really happy to continue the conversation. I think there's a lot of nuance here, and what's really important, in my opinion, for civil society to know is what am I going to run up against when I talk to MDBs? Why are they telling me that they care about private mobilization? What is that counter argument? And then making sure that you're advocating for the principles you hold dear, which, Carol, I think that's what you did so fantastically well. So thank you again for your remarks.
Great, thank you. Jared, please go ahead.
Mine is basically around the current proposals. I think there is a roadmap developed by the World Bank, the evolution roadmap, and there is a report which came out from the expert group for G20. I think it's in July. So yes, I understand, Carola, like what the MDB or what their role has been and the challenges. But in terms, when we look to the future, are we optimistic with those various proposals coming out? Because we've been here like in this area for quite some time, and there has been previous proposals, etc. But this current proposal, how hopeful are you? Is this proposal, how could we align this proposal to be probably aligned with what a civil society would ask for? Is there opportunity there when you look at the proposals? Now we are more hopeful. We can push a certain extent to sort of align to what civil society is asking for. So I'm focusing on the proposals. Carol.
Yes, thank you very much, Jared. I just shared the statement signed by these 74 CSOs that are really focused on this World Bank Evolution Roadmap, and very critical to this proposal that they are bringing to the table. And among other things that I already mentioned, they're also trying to suggest that this assessment should be done externally, not by the same bank itself, because maybe it won't be able to look at their own mistakes or how things are not being working. So maybe an external assessment could be useful for this. There are things that could be useful, but this reform, this evolution roadmap, this adjustment of the mission and the vision of the bank to tackle these new challenges should be also focused on the people, respecting human rights, respecting life, and not profit itself, which is the way many of these international financial institutions have been working and are working right now. So yeah, I shared this document because it really compiles many different proposals from civil society view with this economic justice and climate justice lens for this proposal from the World Bank Evolution Roadmap to be rethinked and adjusted. I don't know, that's maybe if that responds to your question.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much. I'm just looking at the time and realizing we've got about 8 minutes. And what we are going to do, we had originally planned to take a break and then jump into a discussion that focused more on what VCA should do. Our VCA panelists are not available, but I think we've already started to get the discussion rolling on how civil society in general, but we were thinking especially the VCA Alliance should engage in this reform process. And we've kind of touched on that a little bit. So, Carol, I'm going to ask you to put on your Fundación Avina hat quite firmly and maybe have a chance to, if there are any additional, more specific things that you would have as asks for us as an alliance in terms of the opportunities that have been presented, the docking points for engagement that Bianca's touched on, through the timeline and the rest. And also from you, Bianca, in terms of what you see as opportunities, moments that civil society in general, but specifically an alliance like VCA can seize onto. And again, the issue of people-centered and rights-based climate action. This is what is really important. I think this came through quite strongly in your presentation, Carola. So maybe a bit of reflection on that. I'll ask you, Yared, to jump in as well. And of course, members of the audience, I know we've got a number of people from the VCA Alliance, so I'll be looking out for hands as well, just so that I don't forget it. Rowan, you asked the question, you said an important point has been made on how sometimes this funding reduces the decision-making of the vulnerable countries, and how can we as CSOs help? So I think that is also within the same lines of how do civil society, alliances such as the VCA, engage meaningfully in this process, bearing in mind all the different obstacles, the processes that on the surface don't seem as open as they should be and as obvious. So maybe just a general discussion and exchange around that. Feel free, anybody, to pick up the mic and run with it.
Well, maybe I can start. As Fundación Avina, we're very happy to be part of this program. We think it's very important to work with local stakeholders to strengthen capacities and give more information about the opportunities, risks, and explain better about this, what is happening in the international context. There are very technical topics, very difficult languages, and it's very difficult. So I really appreciate how you have been organizing these kind of spaces, and thank you very much for the invitation. I really hope it has been also useful for you to have all this broader approach, not only the Fundación Avina approach, but also this critical approach from the economic justice and Latinidad perspective. And we have to be organized, and we have to keep inviting more people to these conversations. There are a lot of moments this year that are going to be very relevant for these agendas, the climate and this international financial architecture reform agenda. For example, in September, there is going to be the Financing Commons Summit in Colombia, which is going to be the 4th summit of these conversations. And that's a gathering of development banks, regional, national, and multilateral development banks, talking about these topics. So we need civil society to be involved in these conversations. There is a group of civil society that are working in a strategy to engage, to participate. So I invite you all to be part of that group as well, if you are interested in, and if you're willing to participate virtually or in person, and to bring and hear about all these different positions and proposals and to understand it better. For me, it wasn't easy at the beginning. I'm an economist working on climate change for many years. When I entered this work on economic justice, it was debt and everything was very difficult. And I know that people that don't work on climate change, sometimes it's difficult to understand some things. But I really think it's very important for everybody to engage. There's also the October meeting of the World Bank and the IMF in Marrakesh. You can follow those discussions. There are a lot of civil society organizations organizing advocacy strategies, virtual, in-person participation, to tackle these topics that we are hearing about. For example, end fossil fuels from MDBs, start thinking about people-centered approaches. Then in September, we are going to have the UN meetings here in New York. I live in New Jersey, very close to New York. And that is another important space. And I think between September and November, there are going to be also the climate regional weeks in Africa, in Latin America, and very different spaces also to participate, to hear, to learn, and also to propose things and demand things. And then toward COP28. That is going to be a very tough and difficult COP because the presidency we have right now, there are not a lot of expectation of the results there because of this corporate interests taking the presidency of such an important event. But we hope civil society, I don't believe much in politicians, but I really believe in civil society and the movement and the power of people. So I really believe in all of you and us doing these kind of efforts to transform the system and to tackle the climate emergency in a timely manner.
Thank you very much, Carola. Bianca.
Thank you. I completely agree. And I put a timeline of the upcoming events at the end of my slide. So if they're to be shared, hopefully you can use that as a reference. Just to also note, a really good reference is you can look up and I can share the link, roadmap from the Paris Summit of the new financial pact. They have a very detailed list of effectively asks put together by everyone that attended that summit, some civil society voices as well, saying what's coming in the calendar and what can we expect at the annual meetings? What can we expect at Finance in Common? So Carola, definitely if you'll be there, I hope to see you at a lot of those events. But another thing for civil society more broadly is knowing that those moments are really important to really amplify your messages, but they are not the moment to make them, in my opinion. At least that's been my experience. If there's a point, even in research, which is what I do, if we want to influence policy, we can't expect that everyone is going to read a 50-page report that we release on our opinions the day before the annual meetings. What they'll be reading is what management has told them to read, right? So if we want to start spreading ideas, we need to seed those in far before the events in low moments of the policy cycle, and then advocate for them as we build up to those moments. Then one other point on what we can expect and points for civil society. I briefly touched on this, and Carola, I think, nudged at it with her point about debt. But regardless of the type of finance they give, whether it's loans or grants, if MDBs are to continue offering loans in any way, shape, or form, one of the most problematic aspects is that those loans are in US dollars and in euros. And what that means is that a project that is getting money in US dollars is then to finance itself in order to actually get the ground running, profit on the project, let's say solar in South Africa, for example, it's going to be making money off of that project in its local currency. The revenues of that project happen in local currency, but they need to pay back their investor, the MDB, in US dollars. That really, really creates huge problems for debt in a lot of these countries. So there's a range of civil society actions that can happen around the conversation of lowering debt. And a lot of that, some of the reasons why MDB management doesn't respond well to these conversations is because they think, well, all civil society wants is us for not to ever do debt again. And I think that the civil society opinion has upgraded a lot since that began. And there's a range of perspectives, but nuancing how we approach these things and making sure that we know who's listening to us is how we're going to get change. And that, Jared, I think to your big question is why I'm a bit optimistic. I think the reform agenda sits at a place where the biggest shareholders really care for the first time ever because they have shrinking national budgets. And so they are paying attention. They want value for money. And technical solution by technical solution, we're getting a bit closer. At the end of the day, my pessimism instead comes from exactly what Carola said when she showed that great graph of fossil fuel investments. It is absolutely political. To end on a funny note, I watched Oppenheimer this weekend, right? It cost $2 billion for them to do that whole thing. At the time, that was equal to the US GDP, meaning they had to borrow to do that whole nuclear program. So it's all about political will. And this is where research stops, where all I can do, I can keep giving technical opinions and technical advice. But at the end of the day, those who can shift politics, Carola, as you said, I think our communities, our voices, and civil society. So I really hope to continue this conversation. I hope it won't be the end of us talking again. And thank you so much for hosting me. It's been a pleasure to speak to all of you today.
Thank you, Bianca. Yared, you've got negative minutes to wrap us up before we close out.
Okay, thank you so much. So just to go back to sort of the VCA advocacy agenda related to climate finance is to promote the access of local community to climate finance. So I think there has been, I think there is a project in Kenya from World Bank, which is sort of for locally led climate action. So I think there are a number of opportunities and hopes that as civil society, as technically, yes, there are multiple challenges, but I think at the end of the day, it's a political decision. Civil society has to engage. And we are assuming that the democratic society in a number of those countries, how do we engage with our political representatives to affect change. I think it's more of different type of activism, like the global South engaging with our counterparts in global North, in civil society engagement to influence change. I think we are hopeful that the opportunities open up again, and I think through the COP, and there is, we are hoping that there will be a different set of commitments related to the new collective climate goal. And I think MDB is going to be a key player. And I think something which worries me usually is that the measurement of new funds, every time there is a new fund for something, a new fund, but you have MDBs and you have institutions which have been there for the last 60, 70 years, high level of expertise and technical expert, but obviously the political space is very narrow for them. So if we open up that political space, and probably those MDBs could play a better role in terms of responding to climate action. From us, thank you so much. Over to you, Josh.
Thank you very much, Yared. I think that just shows you that we need to have a second conversation about this. But I think at the end of this conversation, a couple of things. Muchas gracias, Carola. Grazie mille, Bianca. And thank you to Yared and to all of the organizers. And very importantly, thank you very much to the interpreters for the hard work you've done. And of course, to all of the participants. Thank you for staying a little longer. I think it was a fantastic discussion. Thank you for the great questions. And yes, there will definitely be follow-up, which I believe Karen is going to tell you about in terms of how the presentations will be shared and what the postcoms would look like. But over to you, Karen.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Josh. And again, thank you everybody for joining us here today. As Josh said, thank you to the interpreters, and also thank you for the everybody joined, the speakers, and for the technical support in the background as well. For next sessions, or for the postcoms of this session, please follow us on our social media and subscribe to our newsletter. Those who have registered for this event will receive an email in the coming weeks confirming that we have the recordings available. And as well as if the presenters, speakers are okay for us to share their presentations as well. And these, if yes, these can be available for download from our website. You could also view them on YouTube as well. So look out for that post mailer with these resources, and also for updates on our next sessions. So thank you very much. Follow us on social media, subscribe to our newsletter, and yeah, keep in touch with us.